Hello and welcome to my home, and I am now going to record a lecture on the lost civilization. So we're going to talk about India. Now, the Indus Valley people are a group of people who are pretty much lost the time for literally thousands of years. They date back to antiquity. They're contemporaries with the Sumerians, right? 3000 BCE, and the Indus Valley civilization collapsed around 1500 BCE, but then they'll get forgotten until about the 1800s, the 19th centuries, right? Um, so they're contemporaries with the Mesopotamian and Chinese and Egyptian cultures of that time, but we don't really find out about them until much later. Their rediscovery can trace its origins back to a man named Charles Masson. Well, actually, that's not his real name. He was a British soldier who was in British India in 1827, and on July 4th, he decided that he had it with the British Army, and so he defected. When he defected, he went on the run. Now, knowing full well that the penalty for being caught for desertion was death, he decided to change his name, thus Charles Masson. He then began wandering around India. Now, ultimately, he is going to be pardoned. He is going to spend a little bit of time working for British intelligence, and then he's even going to go on to become an amateur archaeologist. Now, he's going to write about his travels through India. And in one of his books, he's going to describe finding the remnants of a vast city, as he puts it, with huge remains of a ruinous brick castle. So that is the first hints of here in the Indus River Valley area, this area in modern Western India. This would be India, Pakistan today, right? He's referring to this large city there, and that pretty much gets forgotten. Now, the British, in their occupation of India at one point, are going to begin building a railroad in the late 1800s, and the British Army is actually going to go and begin taking bricks from this old ancient set of ruins. Matter of fact, about 93 miles of the bedrock for the railroad that goes from Karachi to Lahore was made out of these mud-baked bricks that had been stolen from this town that we now know as Harappa, right? Or at least we refer to as Harappa. But it's not going to be until 1921 that you have the first proper excavation and archaeological study of the region. Okay, and they start to discover this is this very huge, organized city. Now, a year later, in 1922, about 400 miles south of Harappa along the Indus River, they're going to come across another find from about the same time period that they'll call Mohenjo-Daro, right? These two ancient cities are now acknowledged as the centers of the civilization of the Indus Valley people. Their names, however, the names of these cities have no correlation whatsoever to the actual names of the city. We have all this archaeology that we found in this site, but like I said, you need to have documentation to back it up. There's a lot of written texts that have been found, these tablets that have these caricatures pressed into them and things like that. But we have no way of translating them. And for that reason, we can't read them. So what we have is a lot of archaeology, very little documentation. So, like, for example, we use the name Harappa. Well, Harappa is just the name of a nearby a nearby village, and so we give this ancient find the same name. It is probably derived from the Hindu god Shiva, right? And as far as Mohenjo-Daro, where that name comes from, that is literally a phrase that translates to Mound of the Dead because of the burial mittens that were found in the area. Now, of course, as you know, anytime I'm going to talk about an ancient civilization, one of the first things I'm going to talk about is the geography, right? And this is no exception. When we take a look at the Indus Valley region itself, what we see is an ancient region that is very similar to that of Mesopotamia. We have the Indus River system, which gets fed from the Himalayan mountains. So you have this large river basin with large mud flats. You have autumnal flooding, right, that takes place that can be quite severe and often some sudden. So you have the potentiality for flash floods that bring silt down and create this large agricultural basin in which to grow crops, right? That's the Indus Valley itself. When we take a look at India at large, the India subcontinent covers an area of about 1.5 million square miles. And it really can be broken into 4 distinct districts, right? First of all, you have the alluvial plains that cover the Indus River in the west and the Ganges River valleys in the east, right? Then you have in just south of that the hilly region known as the Deccan Plateau, and then there's a thin tropical rainforest to the far south, right? Now, the capstone to all of this, of course, is the Himalayan mountains that crest the top of this continent. So there's 4 very diverse regions here on the Indian subcontinent. Now, this land, for the large part, is full of large open desert stretches where water is scarce, and so water does become a very integral part of the societies that form there. As a matter of fact, to this day in India, there's still the waters are a place to scatter the ashes of the dead. It's an important area. It's also an important area. The waters of the rivers are for ritual bathing and things like that. And you can see evidence, though you see this still today, you see evidence of this in the archaeology from these early societies that existed there in antiquity. So archaeological excavations of this area have revealed a total of around 1,500 settlements in the Indus Valley, representing this Indus Valley civilization. It's scattered over about 250,000 square miles. So when you take a look at, again, its contemporaries from that time period, this is actually a very massive region that it covers, right? Most of these are small villages, but you have some of the larger cities like Harappa. Harappa is a major development, a major city that is about 3.5 miles in circumference. It's surrounded by a massive mud brick wall that was about 40 feet in diameter at its base there. The population estimates for Harappa was between 25,000 and 30,000, and for Mohenjo-Daro, it was estimated to be around between 20,000 and 40,000, right, at their peaks. By ancient standards, these are massive cities, right? The site at Mohenjo-Daro suggests a crowded, densely populated city with buildings and streets packed very close together. But despite this very tight composite structure, it does also demonstrate a massive amount of careful, systematic urban planning. Right, the streets are all oriented with major streets that run north to south along the cardinal lines, and with minor streets running east to west, and they do align with that north and south index, right? So there's a lot of suggestion that maybe there's a religious aspect to this, or at least some kind of knowledge of astronomical correlations, right? There's also a remarkable amount of standardization, right? For example, the mud bricks used to build these houses and these larger structures all have the same ratio, 1, 2, and 4. For example, small bricks used to build houses were approximately 7 centimeters by 14 centimeters by 28 centimeters. Larger bricks were used to make city walls and things like that were approximately 10, 20, and 40. In dimensions respectively, so that 1, 2, 4 dimension remains relatively standardized. So you have a standardized system of measures. You also have a standardized system of weights. There's weight stones that have been found from this region that are, again, have the same kind of ratio set up. You have 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64. Right? The common ratio being a 1/16 ratio, right? These waystones are found throughout the region, and since you don't see this in places like Mesopotamia or Egypt, it's pretty much believed this was developed in that region exclusively, right? And in fact, the Indian currency, the rupee, was actually broken down in divisions of 16ths as far as the division of the dollar, the rupee, rupee is an equivalent to a dollar, right? Until the British actually changed it to a base 10 system when India, actually it was in the 1950s when they actually did this, right? Prior to that, the rupee was consistently broken into 1/16th units. Now, probably the most impressive aspect of Indus Valley civilization was their skillful use of water, their water management skills. Now, like Mesopotamia and Egypt, you do see that they have these early floodplain civilizations. They also show this ability with cultivation and irrigation, right, creating complex irrigation systems. But the Indus Valley civilization goes and takes this further. Like, for example, Mohenjo-Daro has a graded drainage system for its city streets to drain water off, and underground pipes included in that process. So they have an underground drainage system. They also have public water facilities, right? There's actually evidence of running water that would go into individual houses. Individual houses would have these cisterns almost set up. There were clearly evidence of individual bathing locations. And in Mohenjo-Daro itself, there's a large structure that is known as the Great Bath. The Great Bath excavators are pretty sure was a place for ritual bathing. I mean, it's a large opening you see in this picture here that clearly, judging by the stairs and stuff like that, is not designed as a cistern or a reservoir. It's not for water collection. It's for some other purpose, but it certainly is for the collection of a large amount of water, right? The prominence of water in daily life suggests that water had a very influential effect on not only the population, it probably had a deep religious connotation. And again, we can see that reflected in the spiritual importance of water to modern Indian culture. Okay, now the Indus Valley people did have a system of writing. In fact, they have found over 4,000 clay tablets that have over 400 distinct symbols on them. These symbols have also been found on pots and other objects. One even appears to be like a market sign, like a street sign or something. But the symbols can't be interpreted. I mean, sometimes the symbols are in strings of 30 to 20 characters, and so it leads to a lot of debate. What do these symbols mean, since we can't interpret them? Some people argue that they aren't actually script, that they're actually just, symbolic, that they are just glyphs, and others say no, that they are probably syllabic, right? And so the debate on that goes on. At any rate, since we can't interpret them, we can't read them, and so we can't really rely on them. Another thing that we find a lot of in Indus Valley civilization artifacts are toys, things like little miniature carts and oxen, some with movable parts like the wheel will turn and things like that, models of ordinary household objects like dishes, pots, beds, tables, spinning tops. You even find examples of marbles and dice. All right. The cities also show signs of being broken into distinct neighborhoods with specific industrial sectors. Like there's an area that was clearly an industrial sector for shell and agate workshops, and another sector of the towns are set up for coppersmithing, things like that. Okay. There's also a lot of evidence of a very thriving trade system with the Indus Valley people. A matter of fact, there are examples of Indus Valley items that can be found in Mesopotamia, including things like hardwoods and metals, carnelian and shells, ivory, and even animals, right, from the region. Right, so that shows that there's signs of a far-flung trade network. Matter of fact, in the ancient Indus Valley city of Lothal, there is a reservoir that is believed to be actually a dockyard, right? Back at the time when the waters there were accessible to the sea at that point, there's definitely signs that this was probably a dock for loading and unloading goods. Right. Typical art objects from the Indus Valley are intricately carved, glazed steelite seals. They often depict very realistic figures, animals, people. Matter of fact, one very famous seal depicts a man seated cross-legged in a yogic posture, a meditation posture with two deer below him. Now, this is, remarkably similar to the later images of the Buddha, right, preaching in Deer Park, right? And so there is the question: is there some correlation there, right? Another very famous figure is an Indus Valley art piece. It's a bronze statue known as the Dancing Girl that was found in Mohenjo-Daro. This amazing piece is so detailed that it is on the scale of the ancient Greek artworks, the first Greek artwork that we'll talk about in the next topic. So we know that the Indus Valley civilization began around 3000 BCE, and we see that they began to become firmly established based on the archaeology around 2600 BCE. They really flourish until about 1900 BCE, and then you see that they'll begin to go into a decline. And you'll start to see the abandonment of these Indus Valley cities begin around 1700 BCE, and then by 1500 BCE, they're gone, right? Now, for many years, scholars attributed the decline and the destruction of the civilization to nomadic invasions, but recent scholarship would kind of dispute this. The time period is stretched out a bit long for that. There's definitely signs of long-term irrigations causing, the soil becoming too salty to become useful. Portions of the Gagar-Hakra river system are going to dry up or change direction, which is also going to have an effect on the prosperity of the Indus Valley civilization. So you see the evidence, at least amongst the archaeology, of a gradual decline. You start to see things, for example, the abandonment of town planning. The towns become more mismanaged, haphazard. You start to see the large cities become depopulated. The trade networks begin to go in decline, right? Then you see the use of that script that we talked about that we can't decipher falls out of use. Then the standardization begins to disappear. You no longer see the standardized weights. You no longer see the standardized measures. Stoneware, bronze manufacture declines, and then eventually disappears. And in fact, then finally, eventually, even the use of mud bricks fall out of use completely. All right. So many of the fundamental questions that persist about the most basic aspects of the life of these people now that they're gone, because despite all the archaeology, we really have no idea of what this culture was like, right? For example, there's no depictions that show any types of warfare or anything like that, so we can only be led to assume that maybe they were predominantly a peaceful people. There's nothing that really gives really good indication of what they were, what their religious structure was like, or their political leadership was like. So there's really important aspects of their society that we just don't know. Now, they are going to disappear, right? And ultimately, you're going to see them be replaced by the Aryans and the Vedic era. All right, so let's take a look at the Vedic age. And to do that, we have to begin by taking a look at who are the Aryans, right? The Aryans are a group of people that followed the time period of the Indus Valley civilization, and quite honestly, there's very little archaeological evidence around these guys, but a plethora of textual evidence, right? These are a group of nomadic people from South Central Asia who spoke an Indo-European tongue, and that's ancestral to the modern European languages. The culture developed a very religious and intensely stratified society that was very deeply entrenched with the concept of dharma, or duty, right, which was the highest moral calling. However, later emphasis on proper procedural and ritual actually gave a stranglehold to these religious affairs to the leading Brahmins, right, to the priests of that period, leading to a sectarian split in the creation of other religions, right? For the Aryans and the Vedic eras in Indian history, we have to look at beginning around 1500 BCE. Right about the same time of the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, and it's going to continue on to around 500 BCE, right? Um, Here we're going to see a group of people that are going to travel through the Hindu Kush region. And like I said, they're not going to leave a lot of archaeological remains behind, but they're going to leave so much textual evidence. We have the exact opposite problem. Whereas with the Indus Valley people, we have a lot of archaeology and very little, well, really no documentation. Here we have no archaeology and nothing but documentation. So again, because of that, we have to make a lot of assumptions. The bulk of the documentation we have are based on religious and intellectual ideas. So we don't have a lot of the other aspects of just like everyday life amongst the Vedic people, the Aryans, right? Now, the Aryans were one of many nomadic groups that had come through the Hindu Kush, right? They spoke an early version of Sanskrit. Now, Sanskrit is the basis of this belongs to the Indo-European language family. So this is a basis for a lot of the aspects of modern European languages today. For example, the Romance, the Celtic, the Germanic, the Baltic languages, all are of Indo-European origins, right? They're derivations of that. There's a lot of Sanskrit words that have made their way into the English language, at least in some way, shape, or form. For example, the Sanskrit word Nava. Nava is a derivation of the word that we use for navy or navigation, right? It means ship, right? And so it's worked its way into the English language that way. Deva, which means God, comes to mean words like the English word divine, right? Divination, things like that. Raja, which means ruler, is where we get words like regal from. Matru and Pitru, or maternal and paternal, to use an English equivalent, right? Mother and father. So around 1000 BCE, the Aryans spread through most of northern India, right? The migrations followed the natural topography of the area. They settled mainly in the more accessible northern areas. As a matter of fact, that Sanskrit language that you see is going to permeate the northern half of the Indian subcontinent, but it's never really going to permeate into the southern regions where there's 4 non-Indo-European Dravidian languages that are spoken there and are still largely spoken there to this day. Right? It's one of the reasons why if you go to India today, you'll notice that there are just numerous dialects, some of them completely unrelated to each other, right? Now, many historians have tried to link the arrival of the Aryans to the Indus Valley civilization collapse, but really, like I said, there's no evidence that it was this kind of a cataclysmic clash, right? Matter of fact, as far as the arrival of the Aryans and into the region, that you're going to see that this appears to be a gradual process that leads to an intermingling of the old culture with the new and what becomes known as an Indo-Aryan fusion or Indo-Aryan culture. Now, there's much that remains a mystery with the Aryan people, right, including their exact geographic origins, but they did contribute a lot of things to society. I mean, think about it. They brought in a new language in Sanskrit. They brought in a whole new set of gods, a patriarchal and patrilineal-focused social system, and a new emphasis on a fairly rigid class society, right, a class system. But the Aryans didn't construct large cities, right? They lived in small scattered settlements, right, that there's no real remains of. They didn't use brick. They didn't build permanent structures. And that's why there's no real archaeological evidence, right? There's not a whole lot in the way of pottery or weapons remaining from this time period. Our main source for this period is just this huge body of written Sanskrit, consisting mostly of prayers and hymns and several lengthy epic poems, right, of deeds of gods and heroes, right? Now, the Aryans themselves appeared that they were probably illiterate, and these were actually written down in later generations, right? The earliest of the writings known as the Vedas were composed sometime around, well, I mean, you say around 1100 BCE to 600 BCE, right? The oldest and most important of these is the Rig Veda. Right? The Rig Veda, which literally translates the verses of knowledge, is believed to originate around 1100 BCE. It consists of about 1,017 Sanskrit poems, mostly addressing their gods. Right? Uh, to the Rig Veda, there was an additional add-on of epic poems to it. The first being the the uh, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and then after that you have the addition of the Upanishads, and then finally the Puranas, right? They've been added to it. Well, collectively, this means the Rig Veda and its later Vedas are composed of, I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of verses, right? Millions of words long. So there's this copious amount of verbiage that we have here. The primary focus of these texts are religion. They represent a conglomeration of different time periods, and as well as clues to that Aryan culture, though, that's kind of infused with this. You kind of see examples of that Indo-Aryan fusion. Now, from these texts, we can glean that the Aryans were tribal, kin-centered groups consisting of local kings, warlords, and retainers. We can gather that. We can gather that originally these groups were strictly nomadic, that their economic life was centered largely around cattle. As they settled down and started to create these small villages, they preserved a semi-nomadic lifestyle. They combined hunting and with herding and raiding and a little bit of agriculture, not a whole lot. One surviving Veda gives a glimpse into the diversity of the professions that were amongst the Aryan family. It states, "I am a bard, my father is a healer, and my mother grinds corn. Diverse in profession, we all desire wealth, and to acquire cattle, we all strive together." This is one of the hymns from the Veda. Right. Later Vedic society, you see an increase in specialization and in professions, a more stratification. Matter of fact, from the Vedas, we can glean some of the following professions. You had bowmaker, rope maker, bowstring maker, separate from bowmaker, arrow maker, apparently that was even a separate profession, hide dresser, right? You would dress hides. You had female cane splitter. No recording of male cane splitters. Same thing with female thorn worker, female ointment maker, female sheath maker, stone breaker, housekeeper, wood carrier, fire kindler. Yeah, your whole job is just starting fires, apparently. I guess there's probably some people that really would love that. Cow herder, hunter, fisherman, smith, goldsmith, merchant, physician, and astrologer, right? The vast majority of women were involved in textile work, such as spinning and weaving, embroidering, dyeing, except for some of these ones that are specifically discussed in the Vedas, like, for example, cane splitter. Now, unlike the Indus Valley civilization, it's pretty clear that the Aryans were a very warlike culture, right? They enjoyed an edge in battle due to their mastery of horses and the chariot. Unlike other ancient warriors, they had actually developed the idea of the spoked wheel. This made, of course, the chariots a lot lighter, easier to handle, and gave them a specific advantage, and their chariots were far faster and more maneuverable than other contemporary chariots. A typical Aryan chariot was drawn by two horses, and it would carry a driver and either an archer or a spear thrower, right? In addition, Aryans also employed bronze weapons, bronze axes, bronze swords, things like that, right? In the Vedas and the epics, chariots are portrayed as vehicles of the gods, right? Reflecting the high status of human warriors who are able to actually afford a chariot. The epics also contain lengthy accounts of battles, and one's status in society is clearly dependent on how much military prowess you had, right? The gods encourage displays of bravery and skill on the battlefield, and creates an overall impression of a society that's warlike and boisterous, with hard living, a very male-dominated culture, right? As stated in the Bhagavad Krishna, for example, it says, "Fall not into degrading weakness, for it becomes not one who wishes to be a man," right? This is kind of reminiscent to some of the memes right now, the be a man memes kind of thing. This is basically an ancient version of that. All right. Also typical to these poems was the constant concern with spirituality, right? The warriors had to fight to have that spiritual dimension to follow the will of the gods, right? He couldn't go outside of the god's will in his combat, right? So the impression we get then from the Vedas is that Aryan culture was warlike, it was hard living, it was male dominated. The heroes in it liked to drink wine, eat a lot of beef, fight, race chariots. They enjoyed music, song, and dancing. And apparently they really liked to gamble. A matter of fact, apparently, according to the Vedas, cheating at gambling had become a recurring problem, as can be reflected by one section that is actually called the Gambler's Song. Here we have a gambler who is reflecting on the negative effects that his addiction to gambling has had upon him. He says, "Without any fault of hers, I have driven my devoted wife away because of a lost bet." I mean, literally lost her gambling. "My mother-in-law hates me. My wife pushes me away. In defeat, the gambler finds no one to pity him. He's like an aged horse put up for sale. When I stop playing, all my so-called friends depart and leave me lonely." Right? By 500 BCE, the Ganges Valley is going to be a very populous region studded with a lot of little tiny villages, right? Small rival states emerged, but the Vedas are so focused on religious and philosophical concerns that we really don't know a whole lot about these small little kingdoms that developed, how they historically laid out, rise and falls of power. We don't know these things, right? The Vedas are just not focused on that, but we can draw some conclusions based on what they don't tell us. I mean, we conclude, for example, that perhaps the transitory state of these kingdoms just made them not that interesting, right? Not that significant in order to be written down or written about, right? Perhaps religion exposing that importance to Rita, right? Universal orders, what Rita means, did not find disorderly and disruptive conflicts between petty kingdoms as compelling, and so they don't get recorded. Now, Vedic culture does give us a lot of other innovations, and some of them will probably surprise you. Like, for example, when we talk about the Arabic numbering system, well, that's actually doesn't originate in Arabia. It actually originates in India. It's part of the Vedic system. Same thing is true of Damascus steel. The development of Damascus steel is actually an Indian creation, not an Arabian one. Indian medicine, known as Ayurveda medicine, is going to develop and is going to be a strong influence not only on Chinese medicine, but also Greek medicine as well. Now, during the Vedic era, you're also going to see the develop of this social order, right? A caste system that's going to develop, right? Now, exactly when the final version of this social structure emerged is uncertain, but it seems to have solidified gradually over time and had incorporated into several aspects of the social institutions. People were categorized into four specific classes called varnas, right? At the top, you had the Brahmins. The Brahmins were composed of the educated philosophers, the scholars, the priests, and the religious leaders, right? Next came the Kshatriyas. The Kshatriyas were the warrior class, right? These are warriors, soldiers, politicians, civil authorities. After that, you have the Vaishya. The Vaishya are the merchants, the peasants, and the farmers. And then finally, the lowest of the Varnas was the Shudras. The Shudras are just the common workers and servants. Now, you actually do have one class that steps outside of the Varnas, right? Outside of that social order. These are known as the untouchables or the pariahs, right? These are, a group of people kind of outside of this entire norm, all right? Now, the idea of ritual pollution is going to play a key role later in Indian history and going to dictate how people should be interacting with inside the caste system, right? It's going to be very present in Vedic culture. For example, members of the higher varnas were not allowed to contact the Shudras or touch their food. For example, the Shudras could not perform sacrifices. Or holy teacher could not even look at a Shudra, right? The Vedas were seen as so pure that a Shudra was not allowed to listen to it. And in fact, according to the text, if a Shudra was caught listening on a Veda, the penalty was to hold him down and pour molten lead into his ears, right? The top three classes were referred to as twice born, whereas Shudras were only referred to as once born. Twice born refers to a ceremony that was initiated among boys when they hit puberty and entered adulthood, right? Now, the Rig Veda explains where these varnas merge from the different parts of the original cosmic man's body. Now, I'm going to be really basic with this, right? You can actually take a look in this in greater detail to see the nuances of this. But for example, the Brahmins were issued from the mouth of the original cosmic man. The Kshatriyas came from the arms. The Vaishyas came from the thighs, and the Shudras came from the feet, right? And I'm not going to tell you where the prize came from. They didn't come from the body. I'm just kidding. Okay. The caste system provided stability to a society, right, and established clear roles to play. Of course, it also promoted discrimination, right? You saw discrimination between the upper and lower classes, but at the same time, it also created a form of a support structure because each member of each class was obligated to look after one another. So there was at least a little bit of that aspect to the hierarchy. Now, like I said, you can't move from one caste to another. You can't be a warrior class. You can't be a Kshatriya and expect to become a Brahmin. The only way that you can enter into another caste would be after your death to be born into that next caste. And the process of that and the design of that we see in the religion that develops out of this system known as Hinduism. So out of this era is the development of Hinduism, right? Hinduism actually encompasses a wide range of sometimes divergent practices and customs and rituals and beliefs. It does not have a single founding figure, right? There is no single sacred text for it, and there's no specific place of origin for it, right? Its core, though, are the Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda, right? The Rig Veda, of course, is the guidebook to proper ritual and behavior. And another influential text is the Bhagavad Gita, right? The Bhagavad Gita is a section of the Mahabharata that I talked about earlier that was attached to the Rig Veda. Okay. That is sometimes, the Bhagavad Gita is sometimes called Hinduism's main ethical text, right? Because it offers a straightforward description of the duties and obligations of humans in respect to the gods, and it describes the nature of the eternal soul, right? One of the heroes in this tale is a guy by the name of Prince Arjuna. Prince Arjuna is preparing to fight a battle, but he's very deeply troubled because this battle is against his own friend and teacher and his cousin, right? And so he's really concerned about this. Now, his charioteer, remember chariots are very important in this society, his charioteer is actually the god Krishna, who has disguised himself and is there with Prince Arjuna. And Krishna explains to Arjuna that going to war is just based on two major points. First of all, he tells us bodily death does not kill the internal soul. One is reborn. This is the tenet of transmigration, right? That soul, the transmigration of souls, reincarnation, things like that. So he says one must obey the obligations and always in accordance to their duty. And this is the second point. You have to follow the duty, the dharma of your specific caste and family, right? Dharma, duty also translates to selfless excursion of your earthly duties if you want to get a little more complex with it, right? So Arjuna must fight because he's the ruler and his dharma is to uphold the religious authority, right? And so that is what leads him to fight, right? Now, I mean, this applies to everyone, this dharma. The gods, even in Hinduism, have dharma. They must perform certain tasks successfully and correctly in the universe in order to keep things running smooth, in order to maintain the Rita, right, the cosmic order. Right, this balance is delicate and it's constantly threatened by demons and falsehoods and human sin. Okay. Now, closely connected to Dharma is also the concept of karma, right? Consequences for one's actions. If you follow your Dharma, you will have good karma, right? Sounds like that should be a bumper sticker, right? So Dharma and karma are fundamental concepts of Hinduism, as is meditation and asceticism, right? Self-discipline and tolerance, right? One then is to reborn, and how you're reborn is based on your behavior and deeds in this current life. That will determine how you're born into your next life, right? Remember, you have this idea of transmigration of souls. In this caste system that we set up with the Varnas, right? You remember I said there's no movement from one caste to another, and the only way that you're going to move up or down a caste is through that transmigration of your soul in your next life. So how you conducted yourself, if you accumulated good karma in this life, that'll determine what varna you will find yourself in the next, right? That's part of that concept of transmigration. Okay. Earlier beliefs placed great emphasis on prayer, meditation, and sacrifice, right? Aryan religion was focused on making sacrifices, offerings to the god. As we move forward into Hinduism, the Brahmins began to dominate these religious observances and performances and sacrifices, and effectively began monopolizing them, right? Some texts that were created called the Brahmanas, right, the utterances of the Brahmas, became attached to the Vedas and began outlining more complex and complicated ritualistic formulas, right? The spiritual and moral questions of the day began to be neglected, and the Brahmins became solely focused on this ritual and following the ritual to the letter. Gradually, this ultimately is going to lead to some resentment, and ultimately some people are begin questioning and criticizing the path of Hinduism. Over the next several centuries, this is going to lead to several developments. First, you're going to have some offshoots of Hinduism, variants of it, but you're also going to have new influential religions develop. For example, Buddhism and Jainism. All right, so that covers this topic, and so the next topic we're going to get into is we're going to begin talking about the rise of the Greek states, ancient Greece.